British Parliament recently passed a bill, a hate crime bill. It's not actually been brought into force yet, but during the passage of the bill, the government brought forward, Scottish Government, my party, the SNP, brought forward amendments to protect gender critical views and the stirring up hatred. And there was the most incredible backlash. And when I tweeted my support for them, I was sacked from the SNP front bench, where I used to be Justice and Home Affairs spokesperson. So I have experience of cancellation by my own party, simply for stating that I believe that sex is real, that sex is more important than gender because it's an observable fact, and because I want to protect people like myself who are same-sex attracted. One of my big worries about the online harms bill is that Twitter don't hold that view. And I know this to be the case. We had in front of us at the Joint Committee of Human Rights 2.5 years ago an executive from Twitter, and indeed from Facebook, who acquitted themselves rather better, I have to say. But I questioned an executive, Katie Minshaw from Twitter, in some detail about Twitter's online moderation policy. If you look at Twitter's hateful conduct policy, it doesn't include sex as a protected characteristic. So women are on the back foot from the beginning. You could argue that men are as well, indeed. And one of the things I noticed that had been brought to my attention by Helen Lewis, who was then at the New Statesman, and Caroline Criado Perez, who many of you will know, is that Twitter frequently takes down the accounts of women who state biological scientific facts, but leaves in place tweets, usually from men or from trans women, who attack women like me and threaten us with sexual violence and death because we hold gender critical views. And I questioned her in some detail about this and came to the conclusion that it's partly because sex is missing from their hateful conduct policy as a protected characteristic, but it's also the nature of the people who carry out the moderation, both the algorithms and the natures of, I think it's largely men. I asked her if their moderators were gender balanced, and she said she would go off and find out for me, but that's one of the many things she's never really got back to me about. And I suspect that a certain type of what some people might call woke young man sitting in California is going to moderate my speech and the speech of other feminists and lesbians, and I think that's really, really dangerous in a democratic society. So I'm really worried about the online harms bill handing more power to the these online platforms, and I think I hope that when England passes its hate crime legislation, they will follow the Law Society's recommendation. I'm pretty sure they will actually, and have these protections for free speech. And I think if the Scottish bill is ever brought into force, which it isn't yet, despite the fact those protections aren't on the face of the bill, thankfully the ECHR is incorporated into the devolved settlement, so people will be able to plead their Article 9 and Article 10 rights to protect their speech. And I've already successfully defended one woman who was in that position, who was prosecuted in Scotland for tweets online. We've managed to persuade the Crown to drop the case on the grounds of Article 9 and Article 10 arguments. But I'm really worried that this bill is going to allow certain cohorts of people, and I'm talking about the gender critical field, but there are other areas, certain cohorts of people to weaponise the law and weaponise online platforms to silence speech that they don't like. Thanks.
Thank you, Joanna. And absolutely, we put years of research into this report, and there's a large section of it that is about sex and gender and the extraordinary censorship that there has been over the years on all kinds of discussions around sex and gender, as Joanna has described. Charles Colville, can you give us your reflections on the bill, and perhaps tell us about the evidence that you have looked at in your committee work, and whether the reflections on the panel so far are reflected in that evidence?
Yes, I'm a member, as you just said, of the Lords Communications Digital Select Committee, and we produced this report, Free for Freedom of Expression in the Digital Age. And we were particularly, we looked at all sorts of different areas, but we did look at the Online Safety Bill, obviously, although that did come slightly later in our inquiry. And there were clauses 11 and 46 that particularly worried us. Those are the clauses that deal with legal but harmful. And as Dave Davis said, these set out the duties of the larger platforms to carry out risk assessments to identify the potential risk of content which might be legal but harmful. This category can be identified in the bill in two different ways. Firstly, whether or not the platform identifies it as a risk, and secondly, there's the even more worrying idea of content becoming a priority content category, which allows the Secretary of State to designate it as harmful content through secondary legislation. There's also real concern about the vagueness in the definition of harm and how it can be enforced, and there's fear that it could lead to a much greater volume of legitimate content being taken down. The bill's definition for what's harmful relates to material which can cause significant adverse physical or psychological harm to adults. The Minister told our committee that the criterion for deciding on psychological impact didn't have any kind of clinical basis. So there was a worry that it would be very subjective when it came to deciding what impact actually meant. And also worryingly, the platforms were then going to be, it was in the bill, it's decided the platforms are going to be qualified to make judgments about potentially harmful impacts. Inevitably, there's a huge variation in users' views on what content will adversely impact users. And our fear was that under the definition, all sorts of controversies, all sorts of areas of discussion under the cultural wars, like the history of the British Empire, trans issues, other areas in the cultural wars, will be closed down because both sides are going to claim that they've been adversely affected by their opinions, the opinions of their opponents. And we found there was a big generational difference in people's response to the impact. We found that over 55s were much more tolerant of potentially offensive speech than those in the 16 to 24-year-old age bracket. And the bill's clause 46 says that harmful impact must be on an adult of ordinary sensibilities and have any characteristics which would make them particularly susceptible to harm. Neither ordinary sensibilities nor characteristics are defined by the bill. And I suppose that will be sorted out by the courts, but it still is, it's very vague and very, very sort of wide, low threshold for looking at what's legal but harmful. One lawyer gave us evidence saying that the definitions were very wide and suggested that if sensibilities, the definition was to be included, then it should at least be a reasonable person of ordinary sensibilities. His example was that if there was disinformation content put out online saying the world was going to end, then an ordinary person of ordinary sensibilities would be harmed by it, but a reasonable person just wouldn't believe it. Not surprisingly, there were a lot of concern about how these clauses would lead to vast amounts of content being taken down and violations of Article 10, freedom of speech rights. You've also got to remember that all these decisions are going to be made by platforms and regulators. And I think, Richard will have to excuse me, but I think many of us are worried about giving these bodies even more power to determine what facts and opinions should be published, even though they are legal. And to deal with this, it was suggested by many witnesses from the media and leading academics about the concern that if content was so harmful, it should be made legal rather than just this vague middle ground. In the end, the recommendation by the committee was that this clause 11, setting up legal but harmful, should be taken out of the bill because it was unworkable and posed an unprecedented interference in freedom of expression. We concluded that if content was distressing enough, it should be defined and criminalised in primary legislation. It's also been suggested that there should be a joint committee of Parliament set up to scrutinise the adequacy of powers and resources in digital regulation. And the committee inquiry that I'm looking at the moment is looking at a new digital regulation coordination forum, which is combining the efforts of the ICO, the Ofcom, the FCA, and the CMA. Sorry about all those acronyms. But it's small. It's only got 6 members. It doesn't really cover many of the other regulatory bodies. It's advisory, and we think that it should be much wider and should have many more powers. And that's going to be the new report that we should be bringing out in a week or so. Thanks.
Thank you. So that's a fantastic overview of the bill. So thank you so much. It's incredibly helpful. Claire, if I can come to you next, can you give your reflections on the bill and how do you think we got to this point where we now have a Conservative government bringing forward legislation that makes the risk of psychological harm based on something someone has said a subject for censorship?
Trying to untangle the psyche of the Conservative government is way beyond.
Don't have long enough.
Today is not a good day to ask, and you know, I'd get banned if I said what I thought. Right. I think that the extraordinary thing is that the government have boasted that this bill will make the UK the safest place in the world to go online. And they think the word safe, the safest place, is the key word. So it's not the freest place to go online or anything else, it's safest. So I wanted to just draw attention to the fact that if you want, free speechers like myself have not won the argument about the tussle between safety and liberty. And you only have to say it will make us safer and you can win an argument. And I think we've seen that in relation to COVID. So offline, we have not concentrated enough on the fact that safety is not a value for society, or it's a lower value in my view than freedom, but other people don't think that. So if you say it can be safer, people will go with it very often. So that's a real problem for me. I think, however, that what that means is that people then view this bill, who haven't been following it closely, as a place that will make the world safer. So, Joanna, you'll be delighted to know that you were cited as one of the people who will be protected by the bill to me, because people will say things like, but what about all the female politicians who are attacked and trolled and so on? This bill will deal with the way that people are piled on, the way that people are treated. You know, you describe what really happens. I'm just saying that's why people go along with this, because you have to think, why are people not realising this is a problem? Or they will say, what about the safety of children exposed to seeing porn or potentially being groomed? They talk about terrorism grooming and, you know, ISIS and so on. We think, right? They talk about suicide sites. They talk about self-harming sites. So I don't want to pretend that there's no safety issues when it comes to the online world. There are. But all you have to do is to say the word safety, and people think freedom should be curtailed. And that's the kind of safety they mean, right? That's what people think. So I'm saying a challenge to those of us who are on the free speech side is how we deal with some of that, yeah? The psychological harm, which is being referred to, was again an argument that we probably lost offline. Because if you look at all of the no platforming scenarios in universities that have been going on for some time, it hasn't been physical harm that has got people no platformed, it's been psychological harm. So people will say that having somebody like Julie Bindel to speak, a gender critical feminist to speak at university, when they first said this, I kind of couldn't get my head around it, would cause PTSD in the people who were listening, right? In other words, that there's a psychological harm. So J.S. Mill's harm principle has been expanded beyond any kind of meaningful way that we would think of it, but we have lost the distinction between physical harm and psychological harm offline. And so they've just brought that onto the online world. But it's an incredibly, as we know, subjective category, because that's why you have things like trigger warnings. Trigger warnings were the kind of, you know, when you think of somebody being triggered into having a psychological episode, it was hearing a car backfire and you'd been a soldier in a war situation, and that might well trigger. That whole psychological therapeutised category has been brought into the real world without anybody kind of noticing or challenging it. And so that's why I think it feels as though them saying psychological harm is not going to be challenged, because we've already sort of accepted it, even though we shouldn't have done. Yes, loads of stuff. Right, very quick then. I'm very worried about the misinformation, disinformation stuff. That is where you start getting truth finder general stuff coming in. You know, what is this misinformation? I know that what is categorised, as David suggested, as misinformation in relation to public health matters of late has been things that did not conform to the official narrative. But we will know that these things are highly contested. But again, it is true that a lot of people think, well, yeah, but there are all these conspiracy theorists out there. And let me tell you, my timeline's full of genuine nutters. And, you know, there are people who think extraordinary things, I happen to think
Terrible
that I
way
can
to
cope.
describe my email.
I happen to think that I can cope with misinformation, untangling it. But you understand that's what they mean. But then for them to say we will decide what is misinformation and remove what is misinforming is a way of absolutely weaponising and delegitimizing opinions that do not fit into a prescriptive, narrow political narrative. And that is incredibly dangerous for all of us in the political sphere. And then the big thing for me is it is presented again, and I've talked to people who support this bill, as this is curtailing the power of big tech. Let's be honest, a lot of us think, hurrah for that, right? They seem to me to be bigger than countries' democratic processes. They act against democracy in many ways, despite how liberating big tech is as well. But then you think, well, if you're curtailing the power of big tech, why are you making them more powerful by telling them they've got to decide what is misinformation, what is psychological? Actually, this is giving the greatest boost to the power of big tech to define what goes in the public square as anything that we've ever known. But it also is, they're being charged to take responsibility for the safety of their users, which I think is infantilizing and paternalistic, because it basically makes them literally Big Brother, who decide what it is, but they're doing it for us, so don't worry. They're looking after us, because we're like children who need to be helped to get our way through the misinformation quagmire and make sure we're not psychologically harmed and all that, blah, 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 blah. And the final thing is regulated by Ofcom. If ever a chilling thought emerged, right? So, like, not only have we got to negotiate our way through big tech being charged with this by the state, so if the problem is that big tech act outside of state control, the state's solution to this is to give them more power, which actually legitimises big tech control over information and what we read and what we don't read and so on. But then it's to be regulated by what is a highly contentious regulator. And I will simply suggest that the Ofcom capture by Stonewall is just one example of one of the reasons why I myself do not consider them to be a reliable regulator in this sphere.
Thank you, Claire. So finally to Richard. Hopefully you have read our report cover to cover.
I have.
There's a lot of examples in there of Facebook censorship, of lawful, sometimes jokey, light-hearted, sometimes controversial material, primarily about sex, gender, sexuality, race, politics. But even in the pandemic alone, over the past 2 years, the policies have ratcheted and narrowed the space for free speech, where we've had people banned and censored on Facebook for initially promoting the wearing of masks. Women banned for talking about irregular periods that they had after vaccination. People banned for talking about the possibility of a Wuhan lab leak, as David referred to. Protesters banned. What do you have to say about that, and how do you think the bill is going to impact? Already there are some very serious censorious practices. Is Facebook reflecting on that, and how are you preparing for the bill?
Thank you, Silky. Yeah, a lot of questions, probably not all of which I'll be able to answer to everyone's satisfaction today. But I wanted to say I've already really enjoyed hearing the contributions on this panel, and I think your reports and this event are an incredibly important step in the consideration of the bill, particularly because this aspect of the bill's impact has been greatly underlooked, I think, in the discussion so far in Parliament and elsewhere. I very much agree with what Claire said, that traditionally in the UK, much of the focus is on the problems of under-enforcement of terms and conditions on social media sites and on the harms that can emerge from people connecting and communicating on social media sites. And it's really important to have this discussion today, and also more over the next year as the bill goes through. I wanted to give a bit of a perspective from the tech company, and I am just representing one tech company, although we offer several platforms, Instagram as well, on three things. One, the idea of rules on social media platforms. Two, who should set those rules if they do exist? And three, what is the role, or could be the role, of government in that space? So firstly, on rules on social media sites, Facebook and Instagram, we create those sites to give people tools they can use to connect with their friends, with their communities, to express themselves, to do that important job of supporting democracy, which you mentioned in your introduction, Silky, which free speech plays a crucial role in. But it's not our position that our social media site should be a place with no rules. In fact, we believe that having policies and rules in place for what people can and can't say is a crucial part of enabling people to express themselves online, because we know that where environments of intimidation or oppression or hate exist, actually voices often tend to be silent. So the rules we have are part of the way that we give people that power to be able to express themselves. As I said before, the question is about not just whether there should be rules, but who should set the rules. And I think increasingly we at Facebook have not just had the rules that we create, but also gone beyond that and started to give a bit more nuance in how we respond to those rules. So some of the examples in your report are about situations where we don't remove things from our platforms. Instead, we either add additional context to them, or we change the places in our sites where they can appear. And I think particularly with reference to the bill, that next level discussion is going to be very important, because many of the discussions that Melanie Dawes from Ofcom and others have had recently have been about what are those next level approaches to rules. But coming back to rules, I think I very much agree with the sentiment that's been expressed by the panel that it should not be for private companies like Meta, Facebook, Twitter to set the rules themselves for what is and isn't allowed on the internet. I think we at Meta have had we've had these rules about, they're called our community standards for what is and isn't allowed on our platforms. We write those not just ourselves, not just a bunch of teenagers in Dublin or San Francisco, but in collaboration with NGOs, parliamentarians, charities, researchers all around the world who help us understand where our rules should be changed, where there might be holes in them. And that job is never ending, because the ways people use the internet is constantly changing, and the way the internet works is always changing. For me, the crucial part and what we've tried to do is to be extremely transparent about what the rules are, so that people who are using our services know what they can and can't say, both when we're writing the rules, but also when we are taking action against people for breaching them. And I fully recognise that it is correct that we can do a lot more to be transparent around both what the rules are and how we enforce those rules. We've also tried to get greater external input into those decisions about what the rules should be through things like we created a body called the Oversight Board, which is a collection of sort of experts and NGO leaders, etc., to try and advise us on those rules. But ultimately, that is all just something that is being done by a private company, and I fully accept that we should not carry out those decisions on our own without greater oversight from democratically elected governments. And we've been saying for a long time that we think actually greater involvement or greater guidance from governments in democratically elected countries, subject to the usual standards and safeguards that we expect when it comes to regulating speech, would be helpful. There are a lot of benefits to this that could come, I think. It would increase legitimacy of the decisions that platforms make. It would also give people confidence to express themselves further online in some of the ways we've been talking about so far. And I think that the online safety bill, there is a lot in the online safety bill that we, from our perspective, do think is well intentioned, and we can speak about that in more detail later. But we do have some real concerns about how the proposal has developed over the last 3 years. I think Viscount Colville gave some excellent detailed examples of some of the concerns we have around lack of clarity in the bill. I also think that the way the bill will be implemented is not yet fully explained. It's quite unclear what role Parliament will have in the drafting of the priority categories of harm, in holding Ofcom to account for its decisions. There's also a big question over the role of the regulator in private messaging. So currently the bill applies to private messages between individuals just as it does to posts on YouTube or Facebook or Instagram. And lastly, the balance of powers, as I mentioned, between the different players in the regulatory sphere after the bill has passed is still not clear. So what role will Parliament or the courts or Ofcom have to determine where there are errors being made in the implementation of these powers? So lastly, the last thing I'll say is I completely accept that in all of this work, by platforms, by regulators, by government, it is absolutely true that mistakes will be made. The policies themselves might be set in places that turn out to be incorrect and which remove too much content, or which actually allow too much content to be kept up when it's harmful. I think that debate about where the policy lines should be separated from the debate about the enforcement of these rules. And certainly on the enforcement space too, I fully accept that we will make mistakes in the enforcement of these policies too, primarily because the benefits of the open internet are tremendous because of how many people are connected, not just for people who are raising money for charities or raising awareness of political causes or campaigning, but when you connect that many people together, the only way to enforce these rules is through using technology and algorithms, which we often talk about. And those are inherently machines which can miss nuance. And so where those mistakes are made, we need to commit as the tech companies to get better at improving them and to make sure we make issue redress where mistakes have been made. So I'll stop there. I think the report gives some excellent recommendations about changes to the bill, which I think would improve it. And I think there's still a lot of discussion to be had in Parliament and in public as well about this bill over the next 12 months.
Thank you. That's a very helpful overview. The other thing that the report does is makes the case for tech companies enforcing the rule of law online rather than their own kind of made-up laws. And you said that it's not the place of private companies to make up their own rules, but obviously Facebook has done that with very, very significant impact for a number of years and continues to rewritten the rules and protected characteristics, as Joanna said, which is inexplicable. I think it would be good to understand more about that. But there's one thing in particular that I want to pick up on that you said, which is this is going to be a theme, I think, as the bill unfolds over the coming months, and we start to talk about modes of enforcement. You said that for some material that is perfectly lawful but that might be deemed as subjectively harmful, that you would change places on the sites where the material can appear. Can I get the panel's reflections on this distinction that's often referred to as the distinction between freedom of speech and freedom of reach? I.e., if someone wants to say something controversial or that could be deemed harmful, that they might be able to say it on their own profile, but no one will be able to see it, or it will be significantly restricted whilst other content is boosted. Therefore, you still have free speech. Joanna, do you think that conforms to your notion of free speech?
Really, and when you think about the way that the Tory party and Tory government approach the freedom of speech of the press, which is very far-reaching in this country, and where privacy concerns, much as I'm in favour of free speech, I have a lot of sympathy with some of the aims of hacked off for ordinary people's privacy and intrusion into the lives of people at a time of grief and things like that. And we're repeatedly told by this government that freedom of the press is sacrosanct. Of course, it helps that most of the newspapers in this country are on their side, so they rather enjoy the freedom of the press. But that freedom doesn't exist for ordinary citizens because of Twitter. I'm going to focus on Twitter again because that's what I know about Twitter's policies, and I don't think Twitter's omission of sex from their hateful conduct policy is inexplicable at all, if I may say so, Silky. I think there has been a determined push.
Politicisation.
Yeah, a determined push by organisations such as Stonewall, of which I used to be a very enthusiastic supporter, not any longer. Organisations such as Stonewall, who have deliberately tried to rewrite equalities law in this country by removing sex as a protected characteristic and by trying to change the meaning of same-sex attraction to same-gender attraction. That's why some of us have gone off and supported the LGB Alliance instead of Stonewall, because we want to protect and we want to keep those protected characteristics. So it's not a single out Stonewall, but there are other organisations who've done the same thing. And this policy capture can be seen in what's happened in some legislation in the Scottish Parliament, and where we had a very, very heated debate a couple of years ago, or less than a couple of years ago, merely on the issue of whether rape victims should be able to choose a medical examiner of the same sex. And initially, the government wanted that to say gender, not sex. Now, I can tell you, I used to be a sex crimes prosecutor. All the women I've dealt with, and the few men I've dealt with, that is the most important thing to them, to be examined after they've been raped by somebody of the same sex. Not the same gender, the same sex, for reasons I don't think it's too necessary to go into. And so, therefore, I think that there has been an insidious project to try and change the law by the back door, and now it's being called out. We've seen it called out in the Kua Reindorf report about what happened at Essex University, And we'll see it, I think, again called out in the wake of what's happened to my friend Professor Kathleen Stock. But, you know, I think, looking at your recommendations and your mentioning of the rule of law and also the human rights principles, and I return to the importance of enshrining on the face of the bill. I mean, this bill's going to go through, let's face it, isn't it? The Tories are going to whip it through, but we might be able to make some amendments to it, and one of the ones I'd like to see is a positive enshrinement of the duty to promote freedom of expression. And if you look at the way that and also freedom of belief, if you look at the way that Articles 9 and Article 10 are framed, I think you can make an argument for freedom of reach as well as freedom of speech.
Yeah. I think there is a clause about having regard to freedom of expression along those lines, which we see in also mass surveillance legislation that says you have to have a regard to the right to privacy, which ends up meaning absolutely nothing. Charles, can you give your reflections on this issue about freedom of reach and some of the kind of algorithmic suppression that might be seen as a solution, and therefore people can say that you can still say what you want online? How many people see it as a separate thing?
Yes, I mean, I think that what is interesting is that the Joint Committee, I understand, is really looking against the legal but harmful clauses and wants to recommend that they get taken out, with a few exceptions like suicide websites, which seems to be a very good sign. The concentration, I think, is moving away from trying to control harmful content, much more looking at safety by design, looking at the algorithms, looking at the way that the platforms prioritise and amplify the content. And Ofcom, I understand, has recruited 300, always going to recruit 300 people in order to be able to get inside the algorithms and to understand quite what the effect can be. The other thing that seems to be really important, and we spoke to a number of minority groups, some trans groups, some LGBT groups, who were very worried about the online abuse they were getting. But what they also said was that they wanted to have much more sophisticated filtering of their ability to control the sort of content that they received. And at the moment, that should be baked into the design of the platform, so that users can filter the content much more effectively, filter who's coming, who's posting material towards them, and so that the emphasis should be much more at that end. They're never going to be able to control the content. Billions and billions of posts, sort of every week. How can you possibly control that? How can you possibly expect an algorithm, even the most sophisticated algorithms, which don't understand context, as we all know, which don't understand irony, to be able to deal with that effectively? But I do think you can look at the way the amplification, the prioritisation, the way that these posts, this information that people don't like, is spread. That's what I think.
Well, hopefully as well. I mean, of course, I think none of us here would gloss over the fact that there is a significant amount of abuse online and crime online. And hopefully groups who experience it will find, one would hope, that they would be able to rely on the police a little bit more as well to do their job and look into where there are serious threats. And too often, I think, as unfortunately Joanna's experienced and others, when you get crimes like stalking and harassment and abuse of women, in particular online, these crimes are not followed up routinely. And instead, the government is blaming the issues to some degree on companies like Facebook and Twitter. Claire, talking about all of this algorithmic suppression and the way that companies might change their practices for this kind of technological enforcement, do you think we're walking into kind of techno-policing or free speech?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a danger that I'm not very good on technology, and so I might put my foot in it in terms of understanding it all. But a little bit of experience that I've had, which is every week I do a thing called Inside the Lords, which is basically me sitting on a bench outside the Lords talking about inside the Lords. It's a completely faux acknowledgement of the fact that I'm unelected in a ridiculously anti-democratic chamber and I ought to say something about it. So I kind of do a bit of a chat, right? So I regularly, because I've only been in there for a year and most of that time has been therefore COVID related, I'll often be reporting on the latest regulations or making observations about things like attitudes to vaccine passports and the distinction between vaccine passports and vaccines. So I actually did a bit of a rant in one about the problems of genuine anti-vaxxers as opposed to vaccine hesitant, which I actually was saying I would encourage to have the vaccine. Anyway, it was a relatively sophisticated bit of thing, right? Anyway, this big thing came up on Facebook, or Meta, or whatever it's called, saying I was breaking some, warning of the content, right? I thought, what is the point of me making these subtle distinctions between all of these different things if they just have me down as an anti-vaxxer and start warning off just because I had a chat about vaccines? So I don't trust those algorithms. But on the boosting, deboosting, this sort of thing, have you got a platform really if nobody ever knows about it? It always reminds me about like when people have no platform, somebody saying, I'm going to just use Julie Bindell because it was just an example where I had a row with some students about this relatively recently. They said, she can go and speak somewhere else. And that's the idea is, go and speak in a cupboard. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's like, it doesn't really matter. All right, 500 people want to speak, but, we just don't want her here. We're stopping her coming here. We're not stopping her having a platform somewhere else, right? I actually think that it does matter, deboosting, right? I mean, it might be artificial how many followers you've got on Twitter or how many friends you've got on Facebook. These things don't mean you're really popular or whatever. But, they should just legitimately be allowed to be heard by those people with the idea that you say, we'll let you say it, but no one will hear you, is not free speech. It's a decision, a political decision. And the question is, why have they decided, what is it that they don't want your Twitter followers to see? Why don't they want your tweet to go viral? That will have been a political decision, won't it? And therefore, my question is, how dare they? Now, the private company bit, I think, is a really good point, right? To a certain extent, if I don't like the rules of a private company to make decisions about what I need to get off those social media sites, that is true. The problem we've all got is it's become the public square, and that is a difficulty we negotiate. But I do have a bit of respect for that. But what is difficult, more difficult, is that these private companies, to suggest that they're not influenced by government, is not true, because they've been spending all of this time trying to not be regulated by government. As a consequence of not being regulated by government, they've accommodated to them and done things to try and avoid formal regulation, which is actually why a lot of the time they've said, don't worry, don't regulate us, we'll make sure we police the COVID stuff for you. We'll just do it ourselves voluntarily. Well, that's no good to me, because that is a political intervention that they have no moral right to make, at least.
We've got a vote.
You've got that.
There's going to be 4 votes in a row, apparently.
Okay.
Silky, I have to give my apologies because I'm going to have to go to committee, but thank you. And I'm really sorry I'll miss the rest of the discussion.
Thank you.
Can I say something very quickly before I go?
All right, yeah.
And I'll try and get back as soon as I can. I mean, on this question of limitation of access, there is I'm basically against it, as everybody else has been, but there's one issue which we have to deal with. One of the most powerful campaigners in this area is the NSPCC, about the protection of children, things like suicide sites, self-harm sites and so on. And I do think we have to address that issue. So there is an argument for saying you don't allow access for certain groups in that way. That's the only argument really I would stand for. I think the others are nonsense. I wouldn't trust the state with free speech. Free speech is normally despite the state, not because of it. And neither would I trust the Ofcoms of the world. My view, frankly, if we have to have legal but harmful or something like it, we actually replace it with an annual Act of Parliament which says these things are forbidden, be it whatever it is. So it's then done in public, it's done by Parliament, not just by the government, and it's done, let's say, I don't know, self-harm sites for children are ruled as illegal. That's, in my view, that's probably the only way through it if you want to do this. I'll be back in 20 minutes, I hope.
Great, thank you very much, David. So, Richard, having heard the panel's reflections on this issue of algorithmic suppression, do you accept that suppressing, if Facebook were to change the reach of certain types of content that are lawful, that does have a freedom of expression impact?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's worth talking about algorithms briefly. I know it's a horrible word and I hate using it, but essentially an algorithm is just a way of making a decision. And there's several different decisions that we could be talking about when we talk about algorithmic application or changes to reach. I was speaking initially about some of the steps we take when a post that someone puts online doesn't necessarily break one of our rules or only breaks a sort of rule which is considered to be minor. What we might do is, rather than remove it from the site entirely, what we will do is continue to have it appear in someone's, for example, news feed, which is the main bit of Facebook, and you can still see it and it would be, suggested to you there if you like, but not place it in the other parts of our services, which are what we call recommendation services. So if you think about Instagram, people here use it, you've got one page where you see just posts from people that you follow, and then another page called Explore where we suggest things for you to see. Now those are two very different types of experience. One of them is entirely controlled by the user because they've chosen who to follow. The other one is using inferences we have about what we think you would like to connect with. And in those recommendation places, we have a higher set of rules which prevent, for example, content relating to suicide and self-injury, which might be discussing people's experiences of suicide and self-injury, which we would allow on the platform because the medical professionals are clear that discussing these things is increasingly important, but we wouldn't put them in a recommendation surface. So that's one type of nuance. The other part is changing people's ability to use I think as most of the panelists were talking about, how much, where in a news feed something would appear. And so we do use signals, for example, if what we know about a post, if we think a post is likely to appeal to a person, then we'll put it higher up their news feed so they see it. For other types of posts, we change where it might appear in that. And I think it's worth speaking briefly about misinformation here. Our approach to misinformation at Meta has always been that it's absolutely not appropriate for a company like Facebook to be determining what's true or what's false on the internet. So what we do with misinformation is, in the vast majority of cases, where people are reporting something to us as being false, or where there are sort of suggestions that something might be false, we have over 90 third-party independent fact-checking organisations. There's 4 in the UK, Reuters is one, Full Fact, Fact Check NI, Northern Ireland, and those organisations are able to take a decision on whether they, based on the following the sort of code of practice set out in the International Fact-Checking Network's guidance, which they have to be accredited to, whether they think something is misleading. And if they say yes, then in that case, we won't remove the content, but we will show it lower in that person's newsfeed. Now, I totally appreciate that has implications for people's, and many of the examples in your report are examples of this, that has implications for people's freedom of speech. We try to strike the balance there between our responsibilities as a platform to try and give additional information to people when they encounter content that those outside of the company might feel is false. So that's our approach. I appreciate that's extremely controversial, and I think it is really right that we're talking about it and discussing it, and we're always changing this, scrutinizing, who has access to those tools and how that's presented. But the transparency piece to me is really key here. I think on algorithms in general, it is what companies like Facebook should do, and the online safety bill, I think, depending on how you interpret it, will make this. Will involve this, is be very transparent about why you're seeing what you see in any part of your social media experience. On Facebook right now, you can tap on the 3 buttons at the top right of any post and click why am I seeing this, and we'll show you the reasons at a high level why you're seeing that post, because it was made by someone you speak to regularly, it's a video, we know you like videos, it was recent and you like recent content, that sort of thing. That kind of transparency is important. Additionally, transparency to the public is important. I think tech companies can do a lot better at explaining all this stuff. I've tried to do it there. Maybe I did a bad job. You can tell me afterwards. But additionally, there is a role for transparency to regulators and to those who are tasked with ensuring that companies are living up to their promises to users. And that's what I think the Online Safety Bill intends to do.
Perhaps we could look at that through the lens of one particular rule that Facebook put in place on using, for example, banning posts that entertained the idea that the coronavirus could have come from a lab in Wuhan, either deliberately or through a leak. That was something that the former head of MI6 did a whole piece in the Telegraph on, saying that he thought it was something that should be taken seriously. But had he posted that on Facebook, he would have been banned for a very long time. Is the company reflecting on that?
So I don't think it's right that someone will be banned for saying that on Facebook. It is true
it was
that
banned content, so
yeah,
the
so
enforcement. There's another thing that's unclear. So sometimes people can be suspended, sometimes people can have a post taken down, sometimes people can be banned.
That's right, and I think that spectrum of actions is the right approach, because simply posting a piece of content which you think is true and that ultimately...
Okay, on the rule itself,
yes.
Has the company reflected on designing those kinds of potentially politicised censorship rules regarding lawful things that people say?
Yes, very strictly, very thoroughly. And as you will have seen, we changed the rules and removed that from the list of claims that we would remove.
When it became more politically convenient to do so, because there's an overwhelming public conversation about it.
That's
so
correct.
my question really is getting towards the risk of politicisation of some of these rules around misinformation and what people can and can't say. I mean, isn't that a very good example of why controversial speech is best dealt with by the public forum, which Facebook offers, rather than by speech police who could be politically influenced?
This is an inherently political discussion, I agree with that. The types of posts that we remove based on views of outside experts, particularly during the coronavirus pandemic, of the NHS, of the WHO, of other health authorities, who told us that this is the kind of information that, if somebody believed it, could lead to real-world harm. That's the reason why we have always removed this information where there is a risk, according to outside experts, of it leading to real-world harm. Now, the uncomfortable fact is that I can't remember who it was who said, when the facts change, I change my mind. Particularly around the coronavirus pandemic, it was an incredibly fast-moving situation where the facts were not known at the time. I think it's true that the platforms, many of them, took a precautionary approach during those early days of the pandemic. You mentioned the masks example. Initially, it was believed that masks did not help prevent coronavirus, and as a result, we removed advertisements for masks which made that claim. Later, the WHO and other health authorities rescinded that advice, so we changed our position. I think that has to happen because ultimately, in our world, things do change, and we have to reflect that. I think
it is another good case for allowing people, the public, who have critical faculties, to just take information at face value and use their critical faculties rather than assume, oh, this has gone through the corporate sieve of Facebook and a number of other political peripheral organisations, so I trust this. I'm going to trust this information. People shouldn't trust what they see on your platforms. People should be encouraged to see posts on Facebook and other platforms with a bit of scepticism and treat it critically. Do you not trust your users to do that?
I think you're making a point that I agree with, which is that it's really, really important that there is space on platforms like Facebook or Instagram for people to discuss these kinds of issues. The question is, or the reality is, there will always be some types of post, I believe that's the political understanding in this country, that shouldn't be shared. At one extreme you have posts like terrorist promotion material, child exploitation imagery.
Illegal
So
it's what illegal content. So this is the...
to add your point, I was going to say, I think you're right that the platforms are very uncomfortable having to make these sorts of decisions without additional guidance
because you've been doing it for a very long time.
But quite in the contrary to what I know Claire said, the idea that platforms are sort of trying to hold off regulation in this space because we don't want it to exist is just, I'm afraid, not the case.
No.
We've been calling for this kind of additional guidance from government for many years because it is absolutely right that democratically elected governments should be the ones giving these types of guidance in these situations.
Can I just wanted to clarify one thing, or it's not even a question, but just as a sort of point. You know, you said we rely on outside experts when we consider the risk of real world harms, and that's an entirely, you can do that. And then you said the NHS, for example, and then you talked about Wuhan and when the facts change and so on. One of the difficulties that I have with this argument is that, first of all, that effectively means that you are doing what the state tells you, right? Because which is fine. If you want to do that, if you want to be a kind of company that just does what the government tells you to do, fine with me. But I'm just saying, don't make out then that you're a private company that's got a separate viewpoint. And secondly, the reason why the Wuhan thing matters, you said when the facts change, we change our mind. Or you use that idea. But the truth is that as a consequence of the Wuhan discussion being suppressed in what has become an important public square, which is social media and an online world. By the way, we were locked down, so we couldn't go and have a chat in the pub. The only place we could have a chat was on Facebook or on Twitter, right? So we were all trying to talk to each other and discuss these things. You said, no, you're not having that conversation. As a consequence of that, we didn't look into the possibility that there was a leak from the Wuhan lab, and now all the evidence is gone. So there was very real life harms that occurred from that, but created by the platforms that closed down the debate.
Yeah.
Take responsibility for that one.
Yeah, that's an extraordinary example.
So, taking responsibility, I absolutely do, myself personally to the extent I can do, but the company does take responsibility for those actions.
And that you accept they're political, both of those points.
In political, again, I think all of this discussion is inherently political. There's no way that you can, we as a company...
Discussing about free speech, there's another point about whether when you apply supposed free speech, you are leaning to the left or to the right. They're different.
So on the second point, absolutely not, because as is very clear from today's discussion, and as will be clear from any discussion about Facebook, we have people on both sides of the argument regularly telling us they feel we are not taking appropriate...
Both sides of the argument on your board. Dr. Susan Hellman has worked for Bill Gates, she's also worked for Pfizer, now she works for Facebook. Now, there's no coincidence as far as I'm concerned that your algorithms are suppressing.
Sorry, we're going to come to Q&A, so hold your horses. We will have we'll have Q&A, and let's bear in mind as well. I mean, the specific focus being on not just the actions of tech companies, but this bill. I mean, this bill will give the state a share of the power over designating these types of content that are lawful speech that is going to be in some way suppressed online. So. Whilst you might welcome that, and I appreciate it will take some of the load, for those of us who really care about freedom of expression, the merging of state and corporate power over censoring free speech, lawful speech, is actually a worry, not a reassurance. I think we will come to questions. We'll take 3 at a time. So we'll do 1, 2, 3 here first. Thank you.
Okay. I wanted to say something actually about the strategy for dealing with this bill that we're concerned with. So I have the feeling, and I agree with Claire, that we're a little bit late to the game and we've already kind of lost this debate about whether or not speech is harm. So we should have been on ball 20 years ago and stopped that, but we've lost it a little bit. And so if we can't take out the most dangerous and ambiguous parts of the bill, and I totally agree that they're obviously going to be weaponized on every aspect of the culture wars. It'll be weaponized to stop the shutdown debate. And let's remember that most of the people who work for Facebook are in California, so you know where they're going to stand on that. So if it's left up to Facebook to decide, you know where they're going to come down. So could we not, in the bill, add a list of examples to say what is meant by harm? And then you can kind of shut down the most extreme woke interpretations of harm and say, we definitely don't mean this. So the lady who was sitting here before, she mentioned one carve out for trans discussions about gender and sex versus gender. So why not add a list of other things and say, well, we definitely don't mean someone who wants to argue against the existence of systemic racism. So that's definitely okay, and you should add that to the bill and say it's definitely okay to claim that it does not exist.
So
it's
could the bill define harm, is what you're saying?
It should define harm through examples. So the more examples you give, the less ambiguous it will be.
Yeah, I mean, just on a point of information on that, I think it's envisaged that harm, categories of harm, can be defined by, I think, secondary legislation, so much less scrutiny, and shockingly that the Secretary of State will be able to just designate categories of information independently as well.
Content.
Which is detached from the definition of harm, which is already very loose.
The idea is that the idea of the bill writers is that it should then give a speed of reaction in a very fast-changing world to new harms that might come up and are seen as really high priority. By the Secretary of State, who advises them on that is another matter.
Yes.
Slow it down as much as possible, right? You don't want someone to have the ability overnight to decide that an entire.
Sure.
That's right, and I think,
which is why I do think there's a growing move against that. I think it's seen as a really big risk of violation.
Even if you have a set of definitions of harm, and all other speech is allowed. So okay, so Holocaust denial is harm.
Sure.
And anything else is not harm.
I think that's risky. That's what they do in Germany.
Yeah.
And I think that's what David Davis was saying, is that, for example, one of the topics of conversation through this has been promotion of or glorification of suicide and self-harm.
Yeah.
And that this might be the kind of thing that MPs want to legislate on, which comes back to our argument about having a rule of law approach rather than we've got this loose notion of harm, we'll just ban things approach. That's a good point. There was another question, I think it was you here, please. Yes, thanks. Yes, you, please.
My name's Gordon Colville. Thank you very much, Richard, for your secretary, for showing up here. I fully appreciate that these policies that you've carefully elucidated, which is really surprising if you know any of this. I want your personal decision, there's obviously a major board behind you, but surely what emerges from the discussion is the importance of completely review this question, having an independent body of supposedly experts. You cited, for example, the WHO, Masters of. Surely you must realise that all these institutions are inherently politicised and have their own agenda. There is no distinction between using the term misleading before you define it and saying politicised decisions. I think the respect and admiration and usage of your platforms would grow exponentially were you to take a bold decision and accept it, regardless of the power really to just operate on the basis of illegal and legal content. Nobody wants to ensure sense of suicide or all this stuff, but on these issues are mass safe. I think the jury's still out. There was a podcast from Snetch last week on the Telegraph saying masks are a complete waste of time.
Okay, thank you. And I'll take the third question then, please.
I timed that well.
That's good.
My name's Geza Terriani. My background is fighting fracking and taking on a Tory government and being successful. What we had was the social media, the internet, and that was the early days when I started getting blocked for a month at a time. Since I've been mentioning hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, a proven cure, Dr. Zelenko has just been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for a cure using hydroxychloroquine. 5 times this year, for a whole month, 5 months, I have been blocked by Facebook for even mentioning hydroxychloroquine. Now, at the moment, have been protesting, stopped my life to protest, to get to the point where I've been down to Oxford University that run the recovery trial. The recovery trial overdosed the patients, and I'm not allowed to mention that on my social media platform with other people. Now, I'm not a terrorist. I've got a clean record. Why am I not allowed to speak about hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, and being blocked by one of your fact checkers that's looking? There's millions and billions of people around the world. Yet, within seconds of me putting hydroxychloroquine up, you must have somebody watching me every single second of the day. Because how can that, even with algorithms? And one of them was a photograph. So this is suppression, this is Big Brother. I am a witness to it. On the yellow leaflet, I've had to go back to print to get the word, to get the government to be accountable. This was torn up by Richard Madeley on Breakfast TV. We've had to find other ways, because Facebook is letting us down, and now Meta is seriously letting people like me down. I've got a social media platform, and we need it now to be policed.
So I think that the questions here are about, there's certainly emerged the need to define what we mean by harm, and Rich, maybe you can enlighten us on how Facebook does that. And then this question around the politicisation, or the fact that inherently all institutions are political. The World Health Organization has a political slant, obviously. The independence of fact checkers, I mean, Facebook pays them. There's people will have certain question marks around fact checkers as well. There's no such thing as neutrality. None of our newspapers are completely neutral. We could get into a philosophical discussion, but we won't. I mean, how do you, I think what I'm sensing from the nature of those questions, and then about, you know, in a public health crisis, are people free to talk about diversity of treatments, even if they're not endorsed by their government, they might be used by other governments or presidents or whatever. Can people just talk about these things? Can you give your reflections on the politicisation of institutions, and then this question about should people be able to talk about all sorts of issues in a pandemic, even if they're not endorsed by the institutions that you reflect the views of, like the World Health Organization?
I mean, there's a lot of questions there, and I think we are inevitably in a slightly philosophical discussion about who is legitimate enough to decide what you can and can't say in a free society, and I think that is rightly the job of Parliament to decide. I think we, as a provider of several platforms, don't have the luxury of thinking about it philosophically. We have to take decisions every single day, and we try to do that based on the views of those organisations and individuals who are presenting advice that's backed by data and research at the time. As I said, those do change, and we need to be respondent quickly to changing them. There's plenty of examples in the course of COVID we've talked about where we have changed our positions. I think we have to continue to do that, and we will have to do that in the future, I'm sure, as we learn more about these issues. What I think is really powerful about what you've been saying, Silky, and some of the questions related to this is the government's attempt to make this clearer through the Online Safety Bill, I think risks making it less clear. Because exactly as Claire was saying before, and also back in Colville, what we believe the bill should do is give clearer guidance to social media companies about what is against the law or what should be removed from social media sites and what should not.
What's against the law? So again, it comes back to Facebook has decided this approach. Let me try and move it on a bit. Would you feel comfortable? Do you feel like you trust information more if it's gone through the filter of fact checkers and World Health Organization guidance? Do you trust that information more?
Look, yeah, but I mean, as it happens, I am probably not necessarily likely to trust the information that I get sent to me daily by people on Facebook who found it on the dark web, who keep sending me mad, theories, right? I'm sceptical of all sorts of things, right? I don't just like wander around going, oh, somebody sent me a video and that proves that Bill Gates and etc., right? By the time I finish, I've gone down so many rabbit holes, I'm going mad, right? But I have to, as an adult, work these things through. The gentleman who made the point about alternative medical treatments, I have little faith in them, but, I'll have an argument with him. As it happens, I'm also pro-fracking, which is enough to frighten all sorts of people. But these are what adult political conversations are like, We'll have different views. We can cope with that. I can actually say to someone, you're talking rubbish. In other words, I don't want to suggest that I'm not a relativist, right? I do not think that necessarily my aunt's theories on COVID, which are something else, right, are equitable, to people who've kind of done a lot of study on it. But it doesn't mean that I think she should be banned, cancelled, or treated like a lesser human being. I'm going to make decisions. But where I think that the problem I've got with this is that all of this, the harms that we talk about, everyone keeps saying the suicide sites and all this. There are either illegal things, and then there's children. And children children, there's a different scale of things. And I don't know how to solve some of this, but whenever anyone talks to me, they tell me about children who commit suicide having been bullied on Facebook. You think I don't care about that? Of course, this is like a big thing, right? But adults are not children. And so what I think is the only fact checkers that ultimately I trust are myself, and I think that I should be left to trust the facts. I can look at full fact, I actually look at what the WHO say, I look at what a variety of people say, and then I kind of, on the balance of things, work it out. If I've only got one version of the truth that somebody else has decided that I should be trusted with, then I am actually being treated as as a child, but not, I mean, even you wouldn't do that with children, and it disempowers me from making those decisions. And that's where I get nervous about Facebook saying, all we want is to be told what to tell you. And it's like, well, don't say that. I want you to be braver than that, right? I don't want you to say, let somebody else decide it. I want you to say, we'll make these rules, then I'll fight with you about whether your rules count or not. Don't hide behind the state are hiding behind you, you're hiding behind the state, we want them to decide. If it's not illegal, it should be free. If you decide to ban it, then we'll then decide whether we want to use it.
I think that comes to the heart of the issue, which is that through this growth of fact-checking and the idea that information has to be checked and sanitised before it can be put on such a broad forum as the internet, Facebook, it's changing the conceptualisation of free speech radically, and it seems to be becoming institutionalised. Charles, do you think that, I'm going to go into some more questions next, but do you, tying those three questions together, let's say that the online safety bill was in place at the beginning of the pandemic, do you think that the government would have created categories of harm relating to things like Wuhan lab leak, treatments, medications, etc.? And what do you think that would have looked like?
Yes, I mean, of course, if the draft bill had become legislation before the pandemic, we would have had I'm sure priority content by regulation would have come in, and we wouldn't have been allowed to talk about the Wuhan leak, and a huge range of subjects would have been seen as very concerning. Unfortunately, we didn't do that. But I do think there are two things that we ought to be looking at. One is that the whole basis of the platforms, which is to engage our attention as long as possible, is something that we should be looked at. The idea that we should be engaged by what is most viscerally appalling or infuriating or whatever. I think that can be dialed down actually, and I don't think that application is very helpful for us. On the fact checking, I've spent most of my career trying to check facts. I've worked in science and history programs and stuff, and it is possible to go to a wide range of sources and come to a conclusion, and which is what I've obviously had to do for my programs. And I hope that people believe that I've had the expertise, gone to enough people, talked to enough people, and to make sure that is as near to the fact as possible. It's always going to be questionable what is absolutely factual, but in a world of post-truth, it is helpful to be able to have some links which give you further information about facts. Maybe a range of different links, not just one link, but I think Full Fact are an excellent operation actually. I think the work they do is very good, and certainly to refer to them is helpful, but also others, so that other sources, so you can get a range of opinions. Like I read a whole range of different newspapers every day. Of course I do, otherwise I wouldn't have a clue what's really going on. And I'm sure lots of the rest of you do too. But I think that to be linked through, to be able to see what other people who are specialists, we shouldn't dismiss specialists, we shouldn't dismiss expertise. Those people have spent a lot of time looking at specific things, and we should at least have opened to us what their conclusions on a particular fact are. I think that's important. That's what I've.
May I just be clear, because you can answer the question. Can I just be clear?
Well, I'm sorry, but I've got to keep the conversation moving. We did have a good discussion about it.
Question answered. I've not had an answer.
Well, I feel like lots of my questions haven't been answered either, but there we go. It's the nature of the game. But we've got to move on because other people want to ask questions.
And social media was supposed to be.
Yes. So other people need to ask questions. I'm going to move on. Sorry. We've got 1, 2, and lady there, 3. So if we start with you, gentleman at front, please. And try to make it brief if you can, sorry.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid certain people aren't being exposed to the narrative. The virologist that David Davis referred to earlier on is a bloke called Professor Luc Montagnier. Now, he led the team that discovered the AIDS virus.
But can you get to just the question?
Okay, the point is this government, and this might be something that Claire can answer, has a very, very flimsy plastic shield and no sword. We need to go after these social media companies that are basically spreading the nudge unit narrative from the government. We need to take them off air. Stop fining them. They've got too much money. Take them off air for a month if they're spreading misinformation and not allowing everybody a voice.
Okay, there was no question, but let's hope you've got one. But you made a strong point. But yeah, your question, please.
So I think one of the issues here is in offline, people can have their views challenged, and if people don't like the views of other people, they can ignore them and not interact with them. Whereas online, you quite often will have people in echo chambers. You know, like the algorithms will put things towards the top of their newsfeed, which they want to see because that's what they agree with. Is that not one of the main factors? Because people nowadays online quite often never have their views challenged. Like as Brian and Scott said, people should just be able to say your view is load of rubbish. But that doesn't happen because of echo chambers that are created online.
So the question is it more beneficial to?
Algorithms on social media.
Yeah. So yeah, is it more beneficial to have people be able to question each other, and echo chambers prevent that? Okay, fab. And the lady here.
My concern is we're grown-ups, we're adults, we've been taught to critically think. We go away, we do our research, we don't sort of just believe what Twitter says, we don't necessarily believe what Meta says, we go away and think. Oh, sorry. But my concern is our children, because it's not just grown-ups who look at Twitter or Facebook or Meta or whatever it's called. It's teenagers, and they live in their echo chambers, and we are encouraging our children not to critically think. And ultimately, do we not think that we're leading to the detriment of the human race and, you know, positive development by not allowing dissenting opinions here? I think it's fundamental to the survival of the human race.
So, yeah,
what do you think?
Diminishment question about whether these kinds of policies diminish the importance of critical thinking. We'll just have a third question from here, actually, because Mark?
Yep.
Sorry, down here. Second row,
yep.
Second name. Thank you.
I have a question rather philosophical. If we have this bill, particularly for Baroness Fox, do you think we are one step closer to some sort of corporatist fascism when we delegate more power to corporations instead of the government itself doing the censorship?
Thank you. So the questions were about how algorithms do create echo chambers, and that means that people aren't questioning each other more, but the approach of Facebook seems to be, well, just leave it to the fact checkers and our rules. And then the question, isn't that diminishing critical thinking, and are you growing too much power?
So 2 points. One, on diminishing human flourishing experience, I very much disagree with that. I actually think the connectivity of people through the internet, through social media over the last 20 years has expanded the capacity for people to debate, to consider issues, to be exposed to things that was never possible before social media was a common feature of our lives. To take an example of mental health, when I was younger, there was virtually no discussion of mental health issues in any of the major press, any of the newspapers, because it was considered to be something that wasn't very interesting and important. And only when people started talking about their experiences online and through social media did the rest of society start to take this issue very seriously. And I think the role of social media sites in helping to elevate that discussion is something that I personally feel very proud of. I think the comment about echo chambers is a really interesting one, and there's actually been a tremendous amount of research on this question over the last 3 or 4 years, which has at present quite strongly indicated that the reverse is true to the sort of common wisdom around echo chambers. Echo chambers is a sort of political science theory that existed, that we all tend to read, talk to people who are like us, read newspapers that, 1 or 2 newspapers that are largely aligned with our views. The concern about 5 or 6 years ago was, do social media sites actually make that worse by only showing you things from people you agree with? There's been a lot of research done in this by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, by Oxford University, that have found actually the reverse is true. That people who spend more time on social media, A, read more news and current affairs than people who don't overall, and B, the current affairs and news they do see and are exposed to is actually much more diverse than people who don't encounter news online. And the reason for that is that most people have on Facebook 300 friends or so, Instagram 400 or so followers, and then that is a much, much larger diversity of people than you're customarily going to be exposed to. So you actually see a much greater variety of, someone's uncle posted a picture and then they share it and you see it, or somebody posted an article from a newspaper you've never seen and you read that. So I actually think social media is expanding the diversity of opinion here. All the questions have been about how do we then ensure that that is happening within a sphere that is acceptable for society, and I think that is, of course, the very difficult question. What I would point to is that Viscount Colville is a very good example of very sort of good recommendations around giving the people themselves greater control over what they see. That's been a really big focus of us at our platforms. We've introduced new tools, for example, things like you can sort of control who will comment on your posts. Similar things have happened on Twitter, I know. We've also introduced new tools like muted words, where you can prevent certain, if you run a group on Facebook and you don't want certain issues to come up, you can control and use those tools to prevent those topics from coming up in your own space. I think that is a more nuanced way of approaching this, going beyond this question of what do we take down or leave up.
Can you share your research with Loki later?
Sure. And as Reuters Institute for Study of Journalism, I'll share the research with you.
Thank you. Charles, do you think that this narrowing, I mean, Richard has said that we've got a bigger forum for debate than ever, but if the rules keep on constricting, then I think clearly some people feel that that's not the case. Are you worried about the impact that this kind of new, highly regulated online forum it will have on critical thinking and corporate power?
Yes, of course I do. But I also do think that there must be some personal responsibility by users. You don't, why just get all, I keep hearing about people, certainly in the 16 to 24 group, who get all their news from Facebook. They allow that to mediate all their news. There is a world of websites, of information, of God knows what out there. They should be encouraged, there should be more media literacy, there should be people encouraged more to explore, to be able to look at different ideas, not just to think, well, I'll press a button and get whatever the Facebook news feed is and what content they decide to put up, offer to me from the different media platforms. I think there must be a degree of personal responsibility in this in order to shape our opinions. And I am worried that there is a generation coming up who do think that it's fine to close opinions down, to close people who have difficult opinions. And they just must be encouraged to explore, to be critical, to what the internet has done is given this incredible ability to find out so much information, so many opinions, and we should use that. It's a luxury that our generation has and that nobody in human history has ever had before.
But isn't it also, and Claire, obviously you experience this a lot, a reflection of the impact that this new approach or conceptualization of communications has had on our culture? That, I mean, even some of the topics that have been discussed here are probably considered taboo. I mean, maybe you wouldn't discuss them in the office or in other kinds of areas. Do you think that this, Claire, do you think that the approach to regulating speech that we're seeing on the internet is also tied in with our shrinking culture for free speech?
Yeah, I think it is, and I think we get all sorts of things muddled up, so I wanted to, because I've got to go because of the police and crime bill.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is another, that's bloody scary. Right, anyway, but and it's coming up in a minute. So I just a couple of things. I think what was said about expertise is really important. I don't want to get to a situation where people say, I know history, I've seen a video, I now understand the whole history of the world, and I'm not ever reading any historians' history books, right? And I have had people say that to me because I've found an alternative view. I would say read all the history books. The thing is, there isn't the history. There's lots of, but that doesn't mean that like every Joe Bloggs, and that includes myself, theory is as valid as somebody who's maybe done a bit of work. And I think people can get lazy, and we can get lazy, and we kind of want an easy solution. It's much more complicated. And actually, this period and the kind of idea of the science has done a lot of damage to that notion, because actually the official language, this is the science. Well, science isn't like that, but that doesn't mean that anti-science scientific hokum pokum, you know, quackery is like really great, and that's like, you know, I'm not prepared to throw out scientific endeavour and research, but it's just that it's not the science. But it doesn't mean that there's nothing. There are things such as knowledge, right? Thousands of years worth of knowledge, and we're like little, standing on the shoulders of very, you know, very small on the shoulders of very big giants. So I want us to know more, not know less. So throwing out expertise is a danger. Nudge units. I wanted to just quickly say something. Like, I think a lot of what's happening, and a lot of the algorithmic stuff, is like a version of nudge. And the reason I don't like it is because it's manipulative, psychological, and not transparent. And that's the idea that, oh well, you know, they don't know, they won't know what we're doing, but we'll kind of influence their behaviour and their thought without them knowing. And that inevitably undermines agency, undermines our capacity as human adults, and that's very bad. So we don't like that. Echo chambers, teenagers, critical thinking. It's not all Facebook's fault, it's not all Twitter's fault, actually it's not their fault at all. The echo chamber phenomena happened before social media, and so what we're confronting is a culture that says, if people say, I find that offensive, they mean shut up, right? And a generation of young people who feel that their feelings are on a par, you know, psychological harm has to be accommodated to at all times. My generation socialised them into that, but nonetheless we have got a kind of thin-skinned snowflakery that basically says I can't bear to hear this or it will damage me forever. And obviously that has to be confronted, but it has to be confronted offline. You know, we at the Academy of Ideas, we run, you know, we set up Debating Matters, a sixth-form debating competition, substance over style, really hard, tough debating. We have the Battle of Ideas Festival. I'm not doing this as an advert. What I'm saying is, you've got to create debating cultures. And I do think we do get lazy and blame social media for everything, because every single problem I ever hear, people say, it's Twitter's fault, social media's fault, and that's not true. Which gets me on to whether it's corporate fascism or not. I mean, I hate labels. It drives me mad. So first of all, state censorship is obvious. We all hate it, we think it's dangerous. Any Democrat thinks, God almighty, we can't have the state. It is equally dangerous when institutions with great power censor, right? So I agree with you, but I don't have to give it a label. But actually, the much more insidious and dangerous thing that's happening is self-censorship. On the one hand, people being frightened to speak out because they don't want to be cancelled. And an atmosphere in which we supinely look the other way. And actually, people who are opposed to cancel culture think the way to deal with it is to cancel the cancellers. That is not helpful. You know, or to say, I don't like identity politics because my identity is not given enough victim status, so I want victim status too. So you have a kind of competitive victimhood, competitive cancel culture. In other words, we do not stand back and say, I believe in free speech for all of these positive reasons. And I have to go now. Which is a bit like, but you can email me. academyofideas.org.uk.
Question.
They're beginning on the business in the house. Quick. What?
Okay.
No.
No. Okay, fine.
Because I got to go over there.
Thank you, Claire.
No, it's not. Sorry, it's just that this is I'm keeping my eye on the monitor. I'm not just
Thank you, Charles, for fantastic insights.
Cheers, thanks everyone.
Right.
Really sorry not to.
Almost that time. I just wanted to ask one more question. You snuck back without me even seeing you. It must be your SAS days.
Or indeed the whips didn't see me either.
No. So one last question before we wrap up. It's no, thanks so much, Claire. It's not a.
Before she goes, Claire, you give me a new idea: elite victim status.
Right.
Sorry. It's not too much of a pessimistic question, because I want us to think about what the impact of the online safety bill will be, to remind us of why we need to campaign so hard on this issue. We're going to give some fuel to the fire for myself and Mark and the team in our campaigning work in the months to come. Let's say 2 years from now, if the bill is passed as it currently is without any amendments, what do you think will have happened? What do you think will have changed? Start with you, Richard.
Well, unfortunately, I don't think I can answer that question because we don't yet have enough detail about how the bill is going to operate, because it is so vague in many areas, as we've been discussing today.
Concerns about what might happen.
I think there's two bits we haven't really talked about yet today, which is a shame. One is the implication for private messaging. So currently the bill requires companies to apply all the same processes we've just been discussing here to individuals' private messages as much as to their public social media. And I think that is a very big step. It hasn't been taken in any of the other places where these sorts of regulations have been tried. There are also requirements in there for, or the potential for the government to require, to mandate companies to scan the private messages of individuals for certain types of content, which I think is not subject to the kinds of democratic constraints that we see in things like the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act and other places. So I think that is a topic which has not sadly been discussed enough. Yeah, I think that, and that implication is really important. The second one is, we haven't also talked about this, but the bill does contain this slight unusual countervailing duty. So on the one hand, there are duties on firms to do risk assessments and take steps to protect people from these harms. On the other hand, companies have to make sure that they don't impinge on discussions by journalists or by politicians as well. We certainly recognise that journalists and politicians, A, are very unfortunately subject to real attacks online, and B, have an important role in the democratic debate. But I worry that the bill essentially establishes a special status for people who already have a tremendous voice in society at the moment, which would sort of entrench this sort of dual category of free speech. And again, that's sort of hard for us to tell right now because we don't yet have details from the government, but those are two areas I think we should really focus on over the next 12 months.
Okay, great, thank you. And David?
Well, I think we're going to spend a lot of time in court, apart from anything else, because, fact checkers are going to become truth-finder generals, and so will be a huge challenge there, particularly in the technological, medical, scientific areas, where, science, remember, has made its huge advances by challenge, and the great disgraces in science, the treatments of Copernicus and people like that, by the church and so on, we managed to break through. But this set of proposals will probably, rather more subtly than I like, depress the level of debate in science and elevate, as I say, fact checkers. So some of us are going to have to resort to court. I'm now on my third judicial review of the government. There may be a few more to come, by the sounds of it. And similarly of things like Ofcom. Ofcom is now, people are beginning to come to the view that Ofcom is not as unbiased as it's supposed to be in various areas, and we're going to have fierce challenges there. There will be an attempt to bypass all this. There'll be private debate channels and God knows what else. If people feel they can't. And that would be bad for democracy, because you've got to create a different set of echo chambers. Imagine a hard right private debate chamber. It'll get worse and worse and worse. And I've seen more echo chambers than I care to count. So and it'll have a general depressive effect on political, scientific, cultural debate across the entire Western world. And what is the one virtue of the Western world? It's freedom. Yeah. It's the ability to argue. It's the ability to debate. And we will give away our greatest advantage.
Yeah. Well, let's hope we don't. And also that we do get some serious material changes to the bill, because, of course, the government's attacking judicial review as well. Yeah. So we've got a real challenge on our hands. And I know you're going to be there with us throughout it, as always. So thank you so much to those of you who remain on our panel. On behalf of everyone, thank you so much for making it out here and coming to the event. Thank you to anyone who watched online or is going to watch online. And also, I want to give a shout out to the Big Brother Watch team, in particular Mark, who wrote this fantastic report and is going to be on the front line on this issue over the next few months. Please keep supporting us. Please keep subscribing to our emails and watching out for action alerts on this issue and others. And hopefully we will protect freedom online that is so precious and valuable to all of us. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Good. Richard, thank you for being very good sport.
great.
pleasure. No, it's
And great to see you again.
I know, lovely to see you too. On the same side as the again, which is good.
Yeah. Well, you've got the expense account now. You can take me out to lunch.
I can also do that. Yeah.
Why don't you do
Not yet
that?
though, because unfortunately,
I just wanted to introduce myself.